In the shadow-dappled interior of a humble peasant cottage in 1342, Yvain Alcott hunched over a well-worn psalter, his calloused fingers carefully tracing the Latin words he could not read but had memorized through years of oral repetition. Outside, rain drummed against the thatched roof of his home in the English village of Walsingham, Norfolk. Though illiterate by modern standards, Yvain possessed a knowledge of biblical stories, parables, and teachings that would astonish many contemporary religious scholars. "Tell us again of Moses and the burning bush, Father," his daughter Faye begged, her eyes bright in the meager light cast by a single tallow candle. Though only 10 years old, she already knew dozens of biblical stories by heart, could recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin, and understood the complex liturgical calendar that governed medieval life. This scene, reconstructed from historical records and scholarly understanding of medieval peasant life, raises a profound question. How did illiterate medieval peasants, working from sunrise to sunset in grueling agricultural labor, develop such intimate familiarity with what we now consider complex religious texts? And what does their relationship with sacred knowledge reveal about our own modern relationship with information? The answer lies at the intersection of medieval social structures, religious practices, memorization techniques, and the centrality of the Bible to all aspects of medieval life. Between approximately 1000 CE and 1500 CE, medieval European peasants, comprising roughly 90% of the population, developed biblical knowledge through immersive, multisensory experiences that modern believers rarely encounter. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council decreed that all Christians must confess their sins and receive communion at least once annually, formalizing the Church's role in peasant life. This decree intensified an already established pattern of religious instruction that began at birth and continued until death. Unlike today's fragmented approach to religious education, often confined to weekly services or occasional study, medieval peasants encountered biblical narratives constantly through diverse channels. Medieval historian Eamon Duffy, in his groundbreaking work, The Stripping of the Altars, 1992, demonstrated how the illiterate masses absorbed complex theological concepts through what he termed liturgical literacy. This form of knowledge acquisition did not require reading texts directly, but instead relied on communal participation in religious rituals, visual learning, and oral transmission. Parish churches in medieval England, France, and throughout Europe functioned as multimedia educational centers. The walls of Yvain's local parish church in Walsingham displayed vivid biblical scenes through wall paintings, sculptures, and stained glass windows, a system historians call Biblia Pauperum, or Poor Man's Bible. These visual representations were not merely decorative but served as mnemonic devices, reinforcing stories heard during Massachusetts. We must remember that medieval people did not experience the Bible primarily as a text to be read, explained Dr. Miri Rubin, professor of medieval history at Queen Mary University of London. For peasants, the Bible was a living experience, encountered through images, songs, sermons, plays, processions, and the liturgical year itself. The liturgical calendar structured medieval life with remarkable precision. Yvain did not think in terms of abstract dates, but understood time through saints' days and biblical events. Each day had its biblical associations, and the progression through Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, and Pentecost reinforced the biblical narrative annually. By the time Yvain reached adulthood, he had experienced this cycle at least 20 times, inscribing these stories into his memory through repetition. During the 13th century, the rise of mendicant orders, particularly the Dominicans and Franciscans, brought sophisticated preaching to rural communities. These trained theologians tailored biblical messages for peasant audiences, using relatable agricultural metaphors and vivid exempla, moral stories, that peasants could easily remember and repeat. In 1311, Thomas of Chobham's influential preaching manual instructed clergy to employ memorable images that stir the emotions when communicating with the laity. This approach created what cognitive scientists now recognize as flashbulb memories, vivid, emotionally charged recollections that resist fading. Medieval mystery plays presented biblical stories as immersive community experiences. Historical records from York, Chester, and Coventry document elaborate pageants where local guild members performed biblical narratives on mobile wagons. The York Mystery Cycle, performed between 1376 and 1569, comprised 48 pageants covering biblical history from creation to Judgment Day. Peasants like Yvain not only watched these performances but often participated in them, physically embodying biblical characters and internalizing their stories. In 1391, a visitor to Coventry described how the common folk gathered with great devotion and wept many tears during the crucifixion pageant. This emotional engagement created neural connections far stronger than passive reading, embedding biblical knowledge deeply within community memory. Liturgical music provided another powerful memorization tool. Gregorian chants, hymns, and folk religious songs set biblical texts and theological concepts to memorable melodies. Faye learned the Magnificat, Mary's song from Luke's Gospel, not by reading it, but by singing it repeatedly during Vesper services. Modern neuroscience confirms that information set to music creates stronger memory traces than spoken words alone. By 1350, vernacular religious songs had become so widespread that John Merck's instructions for parish priests warned clergy to monitor their content for theological accuracy. These songs, passed from generation to generation, preserved biblical knowledge even when formal religious instruction was unavailable. The confessional represented another crucial venue for biblical education. After the Fourth Lateran Council made annual confession mandatory, parish priests used the sacrament of penance as an opportunity for religious instruction. The Lay Folks Catechism, produced around 1357, provided priests with questions to assess parishioners' knowledge of basic prayers, the Creed, the Ten Commandments, and key biblical stories. Archaeological evidence confirms the prevalence of religious knowledge among medieval peasants. Excavations of peasant dwellings across Europe have uncovered religious artifacts like pilgrim badges, prayer beads, and crude religious imagery, demonstrating how biblical concepts penetrated domestic spaces. At Warham Percy, a deserted medieval village in Yorkshire excavated between 1950 and 1990, archaeologists discovered numerous religious items in peasant homes, including a 13th-century bone dice inscribed with religious symbols rather than numbers. Such artifacts reveal how thoroughly biblical concepts permeated everyday objects. Medieval peasants also internalized biblical knowledge through bodily practices. The sign of the cross, genuflection, fasting during Lent, and pilgrimages to holy sites inscribed religious concepts into physical memory. In 1392, when Yvain's community suffered from crop failure, village records document a barefoot procession of penitents reciting psalms, revealing how biblical texts provided both spiritual comfort and community cohesion during crisis. This immersive, multisensory approach to biblical knowledge contrasts sharply with modern religious education. Today's believers typically encounter religious texts through individual reading or listening to limited selections during services. Biblical literacy studies conducted by the Barna Group in 2016 found that only 11% of Americans read the Bible daily, and merely 9% could correctly answer basic questions about biblical content. Modern religious adherents often have a fragmentary understanding of their sacred texts, noted religious studies scholar Dr. Stephen Prothero in his 2007 work, Religious Literacy. Medieval peasants, by contrast, experienced biblical narratives as an integrated whole, reinforced through multiple channels throughout their lives. The case of the Lollards, followers of John Wycliffe who promoted English Bible translation in the late 14th century, provides fascinating evidence of peasant biblical knowledge. Court records from heresy trials between 1428 and 1431 show illiterate peasants accurately quoting scripture to defend theological positions. One Coventry tailor, though unable to read, cited 16 distinct biblical passages during his trial, demonstrating remarkable textual recall. When William Thorpe was tried for heresy in 1407, Archbishop Arundel expressed astonishment at how unlettered men could quote scripture with such precision. Thorpe's reply, preserved in court documents, explained that peasants memorized passages by often hearing of holy books read. This oral transmission of biblical knowledge extended beyond formal church settings. Medieval households frequently gathered for storytelling sessions where biblical narratives intermingled with folk tales and local legends. By 1315, manorial court records from Wakefield, Yorkshire, mention fines imposed on villagers for missing church services, suggesting that attendance, and thus exposure to biblical content, was near universal. Modern parallels to medieval memorization techniques exist in certain religious communities today. In traditional Jewish yeshivas, students memorize vast portions of the Talmud through paired study and melodic recitation. Islamic madrasas still employ the centuries-old practice of memorizing the entire Quran through rhythmic repetition. Certain Orthodox Christian traditions maintain robust oral transmission of biblical texts through chant and liturgical cycles. These contemporary practices offer a window into medieval learning methods. They demonstrate how communities without universal literacy develop sophisticated memory techniques to preserve textual knowledge across generations. The medieval approach to biblical knowledge also illuminates broader questions about modern information consumption. Today, we have unprecedented access to information, yet often retain less of what we encounter. Cognitive scientists attribute this paradox to what they call the Google effect, or digital amnesia, our tendency to remember less information when we know it can be easily retrieved online. In 1342, when Yvain heard a biblical passage during Mass, he knew he might not encounter that exact text again for months or years. This scarcity created cognitive conditions conducive to deep memorization. Modern abundance produces the opposite effect. With constant access to texts, we invest less cognitive effort in retention. Neurological research confirms this pattern. Studies conducted at Columbia University in 2011 found that when people expect to have future access to information, they exhibit lower rates of recall but enhanced memory for where to access the information. Medieval peasants, by necessity, developed what psychologists now call deep encoding, processing information in ways that integrate it with existing knowledge and personal experience. The consequences of this shift extend beyond religious knowledge. Educational psychologist Dr. Patricia Alexander has documented declining deep reading skills among digital natives, the ability to engage with extended texts, make connections between concepts, and synthesize information into coherent understanding. Medieval peasants, despite their illiteracy, excelled at these cognitive processes within their cultural context. By 1500, just before the Protestant Reformation would transform European religious education, an average peasant in England could recite dozens of prayers, name the books of the Bible, recount major biblical narratives, and explain complex theological concepts like transubstantiation. This knowledge was not superficial but deeply integrated into their worldview, influencing agricultural practices, social relationships, and ethical decisions. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, initiating the Protestant Reformation, his movement would emphasize direct textual engagement with Scripture. The subsequent rise in literacy rates and vernacular Bible translations changed how people accessed biblical knowledge. Yet ironically, as reading became more widespread, the immersive, multisensory approach to biblical learning that had served medieval peasants so effectively began to decline. This historical insight offers valuable lessons for modern knowledge transmission. First, it demonstrates that illiteracy does not equate to ignorance. Medieval peasants developed sophisticated understanding despite limited textual access. Second, it suggests that our modern emphasis on individual reading may overlook the power of communal, multisensory learning experiences. Third, it indicates that information scarcity sometimes produces deeper knowledge than information abundance. For contemporary educational systems, the medieval model suggests the value of immersive, emotionally engaging learning environments that activate multiple sensory channels. For religious communities concerned about declining biblical literacy, it offers alternative approaches to textual transmission beyond individual reading. For digital information designers, it provides insights into how humans naturally process and retain complex information. As Yvain Alcott finished recounting the story of Moses to his daughter that rainy evening in 1342, he was not merely repeating words. He was participating in an unbroken chain of oral transmission stretching back centuries. Though he could not read the biblical text himself, the stories lived within him, shaped his understanding of the world, and provided meaning to his existence. In our age of infinite information and finite attention, the medieval peasant's relationship with biblical knowledge offers a profound reminder. True understanding comes not from access to information, but from deep engagement with it. Engagement that transforms abstract concepts into lived experience. Perhaps in this respect, the illiterate medieval peasant still has much to teach our hyperliterate but increasingly distracted modern minds.